All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today is Mock Draft Monday. We'll be looking at a mock draft that has the Falcons selecting Oregon pass rusher Kayvon Thibodeaux. And we'll discuss whether or not he's falling or that number 8th overall spot is right where he needs to be picked.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered with this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, of course, before we get into today's Mock Draft Monday, our third Mock Draft Monday of the offseason, where we'll be talking quite a bit exclusively about Oregon defensive end / outside linebacker Kayvon Thibodeaux. I do want to thank everybody for making Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, as well as now on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Give us a like when you do, and of course, leave a comment for how much you love this show. So today's episode is going to be all about Kayvon Thibodeaux. I don't know how to say his name. I've heard it both ways, so you'll probably hear me go back and forth on that subject. But he was most recently mocked to the Falcons by Daniel Jeremiah this past week. At that 8th overall spot, and he's the highly touted, Oregon pass rusher that sort of came into college as like this 5-star. I think he was the number 1 overall recruit according to ESPN sort of recruiting metrics. And if he wasn't number 1 on the other ones, he was probably like 2 or 3 in the nation when he got to Oregon. So highly touted player. And so he has been hyped, as this sort of the next big thing, the next Jadeveon Clowney, the next Myles Garrett type of prospect. And we'll get into whether that's a fair comparison for Thibodeaux later in the episode. But certainly you see the talent when you watch him. Very athletic, very physically gifted pass rusher. But the knock on Thibodeaux is he's very unpolished. He's very raw. He has little to no technique as a pass rusher. He has a limited array of moves. He's basically relying on his strength, his quickness, his speed, and whatnot. You will see a basic rip move, which is probably the most basic pass rush move that any edge rusher will have, which is basically sort of ripping under the pads of the offensive tackle and bending that edge. You'll see a bull rush from him. But you don't really see any of the other moves that you're looking for a developed pass rusher. Now that he's been at Oregon for 3 years, you're not seeing stabs, you're not seeing chops, spins, swims, swipes, humps. None of those moves that are sort of the moves that you want to see more advanced pass rushers. It's just kind of a basic rip, a bull rush. You'll see a long arm and whatnot, and sort of just relying solely off of his physical gifts to sort of win off the edge. And, playing in the Pac-12, playing against some of these, outside of basically Penei Sewell, he's not necessarily facing an elite who's who of college left tackles. I know the Elijah Vera Tucker last year at USC, gave him a lot of Thibodeaux, gave him a lot of problems in that game. And so, like, outside of, those two guys, the practicing every day against Penei Sewell and Elijah Vera Tucker, you're not seeing that many sort of elite offensive tackle prospects coming out of the Pac-12 nowadays. So you do wonder, okay, had he been playing at another program or whatever the case may be, would he have been as dominant as he was, right from the get-go, stepping on a campus as sort of a true freshman? And that kind of gets us to the conversation about Thibodeaux, where, again, coming into college as this highly touted prospect, this 5-star number 1 overall recruit, he was hyped and he came in, was very productive. I think he had like 8 sacks as a freshman or 10 sacks as a freshman, something like that, and was very productive. And so he was being billed as the next big thing. And now the perception around him is that he's falling down draft boards. And then people were like, why are we overthinking Kayvon Thibodeaux? You know, like, why are we sitting here knocking him for various things? We'll get into some of those narratives as we continue today's episode. But, the question I have is, I don't know if Kayvon Thibodeaux is falling, really. I think part of it is that he may be getting drafted in the Falcons pick at that 8th overall spot is kind of where he's supposed to be projected in the NFL. And we'll get into sort of that topic and explore that a little bit deeper and look at not only Kayvon Thibodeaux in comparison to some of the top pass rushers in this year's draft class, but also some of the past draft pass rushers historically, going back even 20 years, to sort of compare him with some of these high-end players and see if he really does stack up as this sort of elite NFL prospect that's getting dinged. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, we're talking about, eating healthy can be hard, right? I know personally myself, who's struggled with, being overweight and whatnot, like, and you go on various diets, and it can be tough because, like, part of my big issue when you go on a diet is, like, you eat kind of the same things over and over again, and you want to have that variety in your meals. And it's like, Built Bar is one of those things that I think can really help someone like me or someone like you if you're out there struggling with some of those things, because Built Bar is a protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, and it's going to be a thing that you are going to want to eat. And it's going to help you stick to your resolution if that's something that you're dealing with in this new year, because Built Bars taste good. You'll want to eat it, and it's also good for you. They're low in sugar and calories and carbs, high in protein and fiber. They come in a variety of flavors. You can get some of their limited time flavors like churro puff, banana cream pie, white chocolate cookies and cream. You can get tried and trues like salted caramel, coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, so much more. They're always unveiling limited time flavors and always having sales. And you can just go to built.com every single day or whenever to find some of those flavors. And when you do, make sure you use the promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So let's get into this narrative that Kayvon Thibodeaux is falling. And it kind of first, Todd McShay kind of put it out there, and then Daniel Jeremiah kind of also followed up. Then let's get the quote from Todd McShay that he wrote up at ESPN a couple of weeks ago. And it said, "I heard a lot about Oregon defensive end Kayvon Thibodeaux, including concern that he just doesn't play with the same fire as some other prospects. His ceiling is high, but the floor is lower than what you want for a top 5 pick. And based on a handful of conversations, it wouldn't shock me if Thibodeaux fell out of the top 5." And then Daniel Jeremiah on the Move the Six podcast sort of was talking with Bucky Brooks, his co-host on that podcast. And he basically said, "I've had a couple of different conversations around the league, and we're on the outside saying the debate is Hutchinson, as in Michigan pass rusher Aiden Hutchinson, or is it Thibodeaux? I've talked to teams, and the debate is when Thibodeaux's name comes up, it's, I don't know. We like the Georgia kid better. We like Trayvon Walker better than him. Thibodeaux is not fighting for pole position. He's fighting for 3rd, 4th position. Just talking to folks around the league, and they're just in their preliminary draft meetings, and this will all sort itself out. But there's not much love in these NFL streets, as some people on the outside would think. I've been saying this for a while, but I keep hearing it over and over again." So those are two guys that are basically saying that Thibodeaux is not as beloved as people would assume. And again, I think it goes back to that sort of hype train that he came out with, or went to Oregon with, as sort of the next Jadeveon Clowney, the next sort of superstar pass rusher. And it caused me to go back and really look at some of these pass rushers. And that term generational gets thrown around quite a bit. And I basically went back the last 20 years, looked at a lot of guys that went in round 1 and put them into various tiers. And we'll talk about sort of where Thibodeaux fits and what tier he belongs in. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see a graphic I've put up on the screen, and I'll do my best to sort of describe it for you audio listeners. But again, this is another reason why you got to check out the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So I have this sort of tier 1. These are the truly generational guys, and I sort of term it as the guys that would be a number 1 pick in any draft that they're virtually in. And I only have 2 guys in that tier, and that's Julius Peppers, and this is going back 20 years. Julius Peppers in 2002, who was the second overall pick in that draft after David Carr, and Myles Garrett in the 2017 draft, who was the number one pick in that year's draft. And for the most part, this is me sort of looking at it where I thought the guys were going into the draft, as well as sort of using a little bit of hindsight to sort of really sort of slot some of these guys in. So it is a little bit based off of how they produced in the NFL as well, impacting this. And so when we use that term generational, that again gets tossed around a lot. When it comes to the edge guys, like to me, Peppers and Garrett are the only two guys that were true generational. These are the guys that, again, in any draft that they would be in, they would be the number one pick. Obviously, Peppers was not that guy, but that was kind of a different time back then. Then I have tier 1.5. And these are the guys that often get labeled as generational players, but aren't the true generational guys in that sense, the guys that are rarities in that regard. And I have Mario Williams, who was the first overall pick in his draft in 06, Jadeveon Clowney in 2014, again, number one overall pick, Von Miller in 2011, who was the second overall pick, Khalil Mack in 2014 was the fifth pick, Joey Bosa in 2016 was the third pick, Nick Bosa in 2019 was the second pick. And the sort of way that I would term this is these are the guys that are going to be the top prospect, the number one prospect in their respective drafts that is not a quarterback, right? And, you know, a couple of these guys might go number one if they happen to be in a non-quarterback friendly draft, like Mario Williams was and Jadeveon Clowney was. But Von Miller was taken after Cam Newton. Nick Bosa was taken after Kyler Murray. Joey Bosa was taken after both Jared Goff and Carson Wentz. And Khalil Mack's the interesting one because I think Khalil Mack wasn't touted as much as some of these other guys where he was picked at fifth overall because he went to Buffalo. Like he went to a smaller school, but anybody who saw him play against Ohio State in that one game, he absolutely dominated Ohio State. So if he had gone to like a Big Ten school or an ACC school, I think Khalil Mack would have been, you know, probably the second overall pick in that draft after Jadeveon Clowney. And so these are the guys that, again, that are like almost generational, that often get labeled as generational. And in any draft that they would be put in, with the exception of maybe the drafts that include Julius Peppers and Myles Garrett, would be guys that would be the number one non-quarterback taken off the board in almost any single draft that they get into. And then we get into tier 2. Right. And these are the studs. These are the guys that I think are like top 5 picks in almost any year that they're going to be. But where they go in the top 5 is heavily dependent on sort of the talent elsewhere in the draft. And I put Terrell Suggs in this, who went 10th overall in 03, Chris Long, 2nd overall in 2008, Robert Quinn, 14th overall in 2011, Bradley Chubb, 5th overall in 2018, and Chase Young, 2nd overall in 2020. And anybody who's a longtime listener of this podcast, let's talk about Chase Young for a second, knows that, I always often give Chase Young a lot of grief. And I think Chase Young was labeled as his generational player, but I think he really belongs in this category of guys. And, for various reasons was kind of overhyped. And that's, it's not that for me, when I knock Chase Young, it's not because I don't think he's a talented player. It's just mostly because I think he was kind of overhyped as this generational player. And he's more of this sort of tier 2 guy that, again, would be a top 5 pick in any year. But I don't know if he's a significantly better prospect than a Bradley Chubb, who went 5th overall. Robert Quinn is interesting because he probably should have gone top 5 in his draft class and was up there with the Von Millers and the Marcel Dariuses and all those guys. But because of like a brain tumor that he had when he was in high school or something like that, I think that knocked him on the medicals. And Terrell Suggs fell to 10th because he basically bombed the combine. And like, I think he ran like a 4.50 40 or something like that. And then you get into the tier 3. And these are the guys that I would term top 10 picks any year. Dwight Freeney's on this list from the 11th overall pick in 2002, Alden Smith, 7th overall in 2011, Ziggy Ansah, 5th overall in 2013, Brian Burns, 16th overall in 2019, and Jalen Phillips, 18th overall in 2021. And I can haggle probably a little bit more with the tier 3 guys, and you may be able to present a couple other names that you might throw into this tier or whatever the case may be. But again, I think these are guys that are going to be top 10 picks in any year. And it's interesting because you look at a player like Dwight Freeney, who went 11th overall. The knock on Freeney was he was short and he had short arms, right? He was like a tad under 6'1", like 32-inch arms, but he was extremely explosive. Like in 2002, this is 20 years ago, he ran a 4.48 40 at 266 pounds, which and this was long before guys were like training for the 40 and whatnot. So that kind of tells you how explosive. And I think there's only maybe been like 2 pass rushers in the last, when you sort of adjust his 40 time for his weight, that have sort of surpassed that in the last like 20 years or something like that. Brian Burns is weird because like I always consider Brian Burns to be like this surefire top 10 pick. I remember in that draft process, he was kind of billed to be, some people thought he was better than Nick Bosa. I never really agreed with that. But like as a guy that should have been a top 10 pick, it was surprising to see him fall to 16 that year. And I still can't necessarily explain. Maybe it was the weight that people were concerned with or whatever the case may be. And Jalen Phillips fell to 18th, mostly because of off-field stuff. It was, he kind of gave up football and went into music and then came back and had concussions, and so he had a whole bunch of like injury and off-field related red flags. But I think Jalen Phillips in most draft classes would have been a top 10 pick, and that gets us back to where Thibodeaux is. And I think, I think of Thibodeaux as more one of these tier 2 guys or a tier 3 guy. Again, I'm kind of split on where he is, and it seems like based off of what guys like Daniel Jeremiah and Todd McShay are saying, it seems like, NFL teams may see him more as a tier 3 guy than necessarily one of these tier 2 guys that can be a top 5 pick in any year. So when we talk about Thibodeaux falling to the Falcons at 8, like, I don't know if he's really falling is a point I'm trying to get across. I think this is kind of where he's supposed to be picked. He's kind of somewhere in that tier 2, 2.5 maybe. And so that probably means a guy that probably should get in most years would get drafted in that 5 to 8 range, in part due to the fact that he does have some of these concerns, his lack of moves, and a guy that relies entirely off of his physical gifts, which are impressive and great. And we'll see exactly where he stacks up athletically as, in the coming days and weeks, as we, get to this combine and whatnot. But, I do wonder if, some of this talk of, oh, he's falling to the Falcons. I don't know if he's falling. I think this is kind of where he's supposed to get picked. That, right now in my mock drafts that I'm kind of running, I'm expecting the Giants to snatch him up at that 5 spot or that 7 spot or whatever the case may be. And I feel like that's kind of the spot where he's supposed to get picked based off of where he is. And again, I think this perception that he's falling, it goes back to the perception that he had coming into Oregon as this sort of Jadeveon Clowney, again, this generational pass rusher that he was hyped and billed to be. And I just don't see that type of player on the football field. And so, that leads us to the sort of the $1 million question with Kayvon Thibodeaux, which is, which I'm sure many of you guys are wondering now that we sit here and talked about him. Should the Falcons take him despite all these concerns, or should the Falcons, sprint to the podium to draft him? And the answer to that, to me, is yes. But in terms of whether or not I would feel great about the Falcons snatching up Thibodeaux, is based entirely off of certain conditions being met before the Falcons were to sort of hand in that card and make him their top draft selection. And we'll get into some of those conditions that I would love to see the Falcons fulfill this offseason as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast, where you can get all the latest news and storylines around the league. And certainly you want to stay glued to the Locked On NFL podcast in the coming week as we get into that in-depth combine coverage here on Locked On Falcons and across the Locked On Podcast Network. But Locked On NFL, of course, can be found on all the same podcast platforms that you find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So as we get into the combine, that's officially off season for football, but basketball season is in full steam ahead with pro and college hoops. We're coming out of the All-Star break there with the basketball season. If you're trying to get the latest odds, totals, player props, and more, BetOnline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. It remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, news, and more. And it's not just football or basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, UFC odds, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. And I'm sure, you want to pay attention to what's going on at the combine this upcoming week, because I'm sure that may adjust some of these odds and player props when we get to the draft. I know BetOnline always has some great draft props and sort of where guys are going to get picked. And, we'll keep our eyes glued on whether, Kayvon Thibodeaux over under where he gets picked in this draft. And I'll give you guys updates when we get some more insight into those odds in the coming weeks. But you can go sign up at betonline.net today. You can use your mobile device to do that, so that you can learn more about the ongoing trends in action there. BetOnline, where the game starts. So when we talk about Kayvon Thibodeaux and him being a fit for the Falcons, and again, I know some of these things I've raised make some of you guys that are probably less familiar with Thibodeaux, and I'm sure many of you guys are hearing me say all these things. And Aaron, I couldn't I couldn't agree less or disagree more with what you're saying, which is fine. Hit me up in the comments to let me know why I'm wrong or whatever the case may be, as so many of you guys do on a daily basis here. I think what's interesting about Kayvon Thibodeaux and the sort of the narrative around him about sort of some concerns about his lack of fire or whatever the case may be, which is what Todd McShay said. I don't get those concerns based off of watching him play. Like, there's no question to me that, his motor runs high. So there's no concerns that like he's, because you look at a guy like Clowney, and part of the reason why I didn't love Clowney coming out as much as others did, clearly still thought very highly of Clowney when he came out, but like it was very clear that last year at South Carolina, he was just going through the motions there, that he was just basically like, I'm just killing time until I can enter the draft or whatever the case may be. And so he was basically just doing the bare minimum that he had to do in order to play and do all those various things. And I don't get that same vibe with Kayvon Thibodeaux. And, my colleague over at Locked On Eagles, Gino Camilleri, said something interesting about sort of how Oregon players these last couple of years have been knocked, right? It seems like, Justin Herbert lacked leadership, Penei Sewell had maturity issues, and now Kayvon Thibodeaux doesn't play with fire. And one does kind of wonder what's going on with that, where it just seems like these specific narratives come out of Oregon. And, again, obviously we have many years to see what these guys wind up becoming, but obviously Justin Herbert, looks like an absolute stud entering the NFL, and Penei Sewell, if maturity issues were going to stop him from being a very good rookie, they did not. So he looked NFL ready, after basically the first month of the season. So he was good to go. And so, like, for me, when I hear some of these things about Kayvon Thibodeaux, I do wonder a little bit what these narratives, is it related to Oregon? Is it related to the whole Nike thing and NFL teams? Maybe that rubs them the wrong way. I look at Thibodeaux, and again, I don't know the guy. I won't pretend to know the guy. I've watched maybe like 20 minutes of an interview or a couple of interviews that he's done combined. So I won't necessarily use that to be like, oh, I figured him out, and I've, based off of one conversation or two conversations he's had with, some podcast or somewhere or whatever the case may be. And this is insight that NFL teams are going to be able to gain with these combine interviews and whatnot, and with the pro days and all these various things. So I say all that not to sit here and pretend that I know, but just trying to read between the lines and try to figure out why he's getting knocked for some of these things. I do wonder if, to a certain extent, like, he's too smart for his own good, as least how NFL teams perceive it, because he seems to be a well-spoken, deep thinker guy that may have interests, beyond the game of football. And I think, NFL teams just kind of want guys to be meatheads and just be like, they eat, drink, breathe, and sleep football. And if you're a guy like Kayvon Thibodeaux, who, is smart and intelligent and well-spoken and eloquent as he is, they have concerns about that, like, and so that's the only thing I can sort of glean from it, where, people may be concerned about that. Again, I don't have any concerns about that. I don't know the guy. I don't pretend to know the guy, but in terms of that, like, I wouldn't be too worried about that based off of what I have seen. Obviously we'll see what happens over the next 8+ weeks with some of these rumors and whispers that will come about with Thibodeaux, and we'll just sort of see how that unfolds and whatnot. But, if the Falcons were to land Thibodeaux, I would not have any problems with him. But, and it goes back to a point you've heard me make a number of times now on the podcast when we've talked about, the Falcons taking a pass rusher at that 8th overall spot. Like, when we talk about, tier 1 versus tier 2 and whatnot, like, Aiden Hutchinson is interesting to me, because I think Aiden Hutchinson couldn't, depending on how he does in this combine, could get himself in that tier 1.5 area. Again, like, he has the same sort of polish as a Nick Bosa, as a Joey Bosa, with the sort of technical. And the real question for him is just how good of an athlete is he? And that was the thing about the Bosas, where they weren't like elite athletes. They weren't bad athletes by any means, but they just weren't like incredible athletes. And you hear some of the rumors that, Hutchinson's going to test really well. And sort of that is the difference between basically being a tier 2 guy. Like, if he's just an average athlete or whatever the case may be, maybe he's more of a tier 2 guy. But if he can showcase that he is also a much better athlete than, either Joey or Nick Bosa, I think he firmly fits himself into that tier 1.5. And so it goes back to something that Daniel Jeremiah said, where there's like, at least to NFL teams, there is a considerable gap between where Aiden Hutchinson is and where Kayvon Thibodeaux is. And if Hutchinson's in that 1.5 tier, then Thibodeau's somewhere in that 2 or maybe even third tier. And it may sound like, some of these teams think Trayvon Walker is potentially in that third tier as the sort of, great high level athlete in the same sort of sense that a Jalen Phillips or Ziggy Ansah or an Alden Smith were when they came out in the draft. So it'll be interesting for me. But like if the Falcons were to take Kayvon Thibodeaux, I have no problem with them taking him. But I think you would have to have a mentor. And again, it gets back to this conversation with some of these quote unquote second, third tier pass rushers. Like none of these guys, Hutchinson, I can be relatively confident he's going to come in and hit the ground running in the NFL. Whether that leads to him getting 8 sacks or 12 sacks as a rookie or, 50 pressures or 80 pressures as a rookie, who knows? But like, I feel pretty confident he can come in right away and impact. These other guys, I think, are going to take some time. They're going to need some development. And we know it takes pass rushers 2, 3 or more years for them to really find their feet. And I think Thibodeaux fits firmly in that category, given how much lack of development you could say he's had at Oregon. And so for him, like if the Falcons were to take him, I wouldn't have a problem with the Falcons taking him, but I want to have that mentor. I want to have that veteran across from him that can sort of show him the ropes, similar to what we saw with, Dwight Freeney and Vic Beasley. Again, a lot of people attribute Freeney's presence to why Vic Beasley had that breakout season. And then the minute Freeney left town, Vic Beasley kind of reverted back to being, just a guy. And if we were, extending the tiers beyond, 3, Vic Beasley probably would be in that tier 4 or whatever the case may be, a top 15 pick in any draft that he would have been, but not anybody special. In that tier 4 will probably be a whole lot more guys than the initial list tier list showed. But I digress. And then you look at other sort of mentor relationships. Justin Houston, Odafe Owe, formerly known as Jason Owe, attributed Justin Houston's presence in Baltimore this past year as one of the big reasons why he was able to have sort of a breakout year. And Owe entered, with very limited experience. And so whether we're talking about a Thibodeaux, whether we're talking about David Ojabo, Trayvon Walker, Jermaine Johnson, George Karlaftis, any of these edge rushers that people are talking about potentially for the Falcons, I would want to see all of these guys have a mentor. I would feel much better. When you ask me the question, do you think the Falcons should take that guy at 8? I'm like, sure. If they want to take a pass rusher, I'm not against the Falcons taking a pass rusher. I'm never against the Falcons taking a pass rusher. I've been talking about the Falcons wanting the Falcons to take a pass rusher for almost 20 years. So I'm always for the Falcons taking a pass rusher, but I don't think they should put all their eggs in, this rookie's going to come in and be a serious impact player. Go out there and get a veteran, whether that's a Justin Houston, who's a free agent now, a Jason Pierre-Paul, who's known for his leadership skills, Whitney Merciless, another guy, Ryan Kerrigan, who has experience with this coaching staff from his days at Purdue or whatever case may be. Some of these veteran players that sort of have the experience or noted for being high character guys that can be sort of what Lee Smith was in the locker room for Kyle Pitts this past year, a guy that's going to, no one was questioning Kyle Pitts' maturity or anything like that, but you want to give these young guys an opportunity to succeed. You don't want Kayvon Thibodeaux or whoever to come into this room and basically look across the room and it's him, Adeola Ogundeji, some sort of mid-tier free agent or whatever the case may be, and going to have the pressure to be the guy. You want him to have somebody that he can lean on in that veteran presence, even if that veteran presence is not going to be a big-time contributor, down in, down out. Some of these guys like Justin Houston, JPP, Merciless, Kerrigan, they're probably like 5-sack guys at this point in time in their careers or whatever the case may be. But obviously, with the Falcons, we'll take 5 sacks. That would be a big boost to what we had a year ago. That 5-sack guy would have led the team in sacks, right? So we'll take that. But like for me, like that's part of it where it's like when we talk about this edge rusher group and we talk about, who the Falcons should take, like I'm like, okay, who are we going to sign a free agency? Because if we're going to take an edge rusher, which is fine, again, I'm all for that, but I want to have that guy come into a room that's, loaded with some veteran talent and whatnot, and can take all the pressure off of that guy coming into the building and having these expectations. Because let's be honest, if the Falcons take an edge rusher and because of how, going back to what I said, 20 years in the making and the baggage from John Abraham, Jamal Anderson, Vic Beasley, Takk McKinley, all these failed first-round picks, Dante Fowler, et cetera, Ray Edwards. The Falcons, basically since the Falcons brought in John Abraham 16 years ago, like they have just whiffed after whiffed after whiffed on these edge rushers. And so those guys are going to come in with baggage. And the truth, whether it's fair, and certainly it's not fair, but particularly a player like Thibodeaux, given the hype that he's had and the expectations, again, you're going to have people talking about him like he's a Clowney, like he's a Myles Garrett. And I don't think he's that guy. I think he's more of a Jalen Phillips, more of a Bradley Chubb, more of a, Brian Burns type of player, which again, a very good player. But again, those expectations are going to be extremely high for that player coming into the building. There's going to be extreme expectations. And, I kind of like, ooh, let's pump the brakes on that a little bit. And so let's not put all our eggs in that basket, because that's going to lead to a backlash, right? That was a big reason why there was so much negativity surrounding Vic Beasley 1 year into his career, where he came in with a lot of hype as the new John Abraham, and he's going to get 10, 15 sacks as a rookie. That was the conversation back in 2015. And it was like, how many sacks is he going to get as rookie? Oh, he's going to get 10. He's going to get 12. I think he can get 15 or whatever the case may be. And then he wound up like 4.5. And then you had that, a year later, everybody going to that 2016 season, particularly when he got off to a slow start in that 2016 season. Because I remember talking about this on the podcast back then, where people were asking questions like, is he a bust? Is he a bust? And it's like, guys, you got to relax. He's only 1 year into his NFL career. And that was part of the reason why when he started to produce in that 2016 season, there was such a groundswell, because it was basically backlash to the backlash, because all these people were calling him a bust because of all the hype. And you just started this pendulum swing. And so people were like, oh, he's the next greatest thing. And then that only built up the hype even more. And so that when he, fell back down to earth the following year, then you had so the point I'm trying to make is like, these expectations can be a nightmare. And so particularly for a player like Kayvon Thibodeaux, who's, been touted as, again, the next big thing, I do worry about that to a certain extent if he were to land in Atlanta. But in terms of answering the question, would he fall to the Atlanta? I don't think it's falling, right? That's basically, long story short, is I think that 5 to 8 range is where he would get drafted in most years, in most drafts. And so I don't think we should talk about it as him falling in this draft. And, it's just a question of, is he going to be there? Is a team like the Giants, who also need a pass rush, a team like the Jets, who need a pass rush, are they going to, pull the trigger on him at the top of the draft? Houston certainly is another team that wants to get a pass rush, particularly with Lovie Smith. If he can have any influence on how to build that defense, he wants to build front to back. And so maybe they pull the trigger at 3. So again, guessing, I think Thibodeaux is going to go somewhere in that 3. If the Falcons were to pass on him, and again, that's the interesting thing about the whole notion, if quote unquote a player falls, is like, we assume, oh, the player's going to fall and all these other teams are going to pass, and then the Falcons will snatch him up. But it may be the reasons that he's falling. And again, I don't think that's the accurate way of describing it, but it also would potentially include the Falcons passing on him. But again, probably that 8 to Atlanta, that 9 spot to Denver, all these teams picking somewhere in the top 10, whether it's the Giants, the Jets, Houston, Atlanta, Denver, or whatever the case may be, you would imagine not all of them going to pass on a pass rusher with Thibodeaux's talent. But we'll just sort of have to see how that unpacks and unfolds over the next 2 months. So we'll just see. That's where we're going to leave it here, guys, for another Mock Draft Monday. Tomorrow's episode, we'll figure it out. We'll see what we do on tomorrow's episode. We'll maybe get a little bit more into these pass rushers and some of these edge rushers and combine stuff. I was doing some research over the weekend. Maybe I'll present those findings to you on tomorrow's episode. And obviously we'll have more combine coverage in the coming days and weeks. We should get, a presser from Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot later in the week. And maybe we'll have some guests come on to react to that, as well as give you more combine coverage as this week unfolds. So obviously you want to make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, you can send in questions to be answered on future episodes via Twitter at Locked On Falcons, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, guys. And before we duck out of here, if you want to get more insights, different opinions on Kayvon Thibodeaux, maybe guys like Ryan Tracy and Eric Crocker have a slightly different opinion and really do see Thibodeaux as that sort of generational talent that is falling, you can get that insight at the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So that will do it for us here, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's meandering conversation about Kayvon Thibodeaux. We'll see sort of where he tests and whatnot. If I'm to put a number on it, I'm guessing he'll probably test similar to Jalen Phillips last year in terms of his height, weight, speed, and whatnot, which is a very good tester, but not necessarily like, oh my God, he just broke the combine or whatever the case may be. So we'll see how that fares for Kayvon Thibodeaux later this week. I think the edge rushers are a Sunday workout, if I'm not mistaken, but we'll find out. So we'll keep our ears glued, eyes glued, ears open. All right, I'm out of it, guys. I'll just end it there. Okay, we're done with today. I appreciate it, guys. Till then.